Professor Glenda Gray, who's also CEO of the South African Medical Research Council, has taken part in South Africa's leg of the vaccine trial that's currently being developed at Oxford University. Now, she was screened and vaccinated at the University of Cape Town's Lung Institute, and it's hoped that her participation will legitimise the safety of this vaccine. South Africa is currently testing the efficacy of the vaccine developed by Oxford's Jenner Institute. The final phase of the human trial is currently underway, and if successful, a viable vaccine could be ready as early as next year. Let's begin our conversation by taking a look at her experience in Cape Town yesterday.
Little bit of blood. Nothing to worry about. Okay. Any pain if I press on that? No induration there. So this is going to be your little ruler for the next week. What's very nice is that it's see-through, and I like these rings. So if there's any hardness or lump induration, you measure that. If there's any redness around that, you measure that as well. So you can just sort of put it over there and see where it fits. So that's about, I would say, 2 millimeters worth. Okay, so you might need some assistance or use the mirror.
All right, let's bring in Professor Glenda Gray, who joins us now via Skype in Cape Town this morning. Prof, thanks very much for your time, and once again, welcome to the AM Report. Let me start by asking, how are you feeling this morning? Any superpowers yet?
No pain, and I'm feeling very well. It was a very wonderful experience, and I'm very excited to be a participant. Usually I'm on the other side of the needle, and this time I was on the receiving end.
Absolutely. Help us contextualize this moment. Why was this important, and where do we go to from here in the development of a vaccine?
It's important to find a vaccine, and I want to be part of the solution. And so as a scientist, I feel it's important to also participate in vaccine trials. I've been doing HIV vaccine research for decades, and I've always been the scientist. And for once I wanted to be the participant, I also wanted to contribute to science. I'm a healthcare worker, and I also want to make sure that we evaluate these vaccines in healthcare workers, because healthcare workers will also be beneficiaries of a vaccine that works for COVID.
And you know, for lay people who aren't necessarily averse in health speak, for lack of a better term, where are we in our development of a vaccine now? You know, often we speak about phase 1, final phase, third phase. Now there are timelines suggesting that if everything goes according to plan, as early as next year we might have a vaccine. Help us place this development in the overall timeline of finally being able to get a vaccine through this study.
So there is a race to find a vaccine, and there are about 4 companies that are busy evaluating vaccines. We are for the CHIP ad, or the Oxford study, we're at the beginning of the efficacy phase. So the study that I'm involved in will give an early readout on efficacy, particularly in South Africa. And if this vaccine works, it would be available, we'll know by the end of the year, early 2021. And after that, you have to then go through a registration process before it can be fully available to the public. But as we speak, another vaccine trial will start in South Africa, and a third one will start in mid-September. And so we are very lucky to be involved in 3 programs at this moment in time, and possibly a lot more towards the end of the year. There is a race. Usually this kind of vaccine trial takes between 5 and 8 years to see whether it works, and we're trying to do everything in a couple of months.
And what does this mean for you? You've, I guess, have taken a dose of that vaccine yesterday. How do we track whether or not what you've received is in fact working?
Well, I was in a trial where you either get the vaccine or you get a placebo. And so we compare the vaccine to a placebo to make sure that we can understand the safety and the reactogenicity and the immune response. And so at this stage of the game, I don't know whether I got the active vaccine or whether I got the placebo or the normal saline. If this vaccine does work, the people that got the normal saline or placebo will get the vaccine at the end of the trial.
Okay, that's interesting. The global context is that Russia has come out to say that they've actually found a vaccine, and my understanding is that Vladimir Putin's daughter is receiving this too. did it strike you as strange that none of the data in that particular study was made available to the scientific community before we got to where they claim they are?
There's a very long process to do vaccine trials. First of all, you have to establish its safety in animals. Normally, you do non-human primate challenges to make sure your vaccine would be effective in a model that's similar to humans. And then you go into phase 1 to make sure that it's safe, you find the right dose. You look at the immune response, and then you accelerate your development into a phase 3 trial, which usually about 30 to 40,000 people. In the absence of that, you can't make a call that your vaccine is effective.
Yeah, and it's a bit strange, isn't it, that we don't really know how much of that Russia has actually done?
It's very strange because most scientists publish their data. Also, we work with our regulatory authorities. So before you can license a vaccine, your regulator has to look at all the data and has to say, yes, we agree with you, this is an effective vaccine. So you need to work very closely with our SAHPRA or with the FDA. And in the absence of that, it's very hard to say that you have data that shows that your vaccine is effective. So if they have this data, they have not shared it globally with anybody, and they have not published their data in any of the well-known medical journals.
That said, I don't imagine it means we can ignore what's happening in Russia. In fact, the World Health Organization, I think, is now engaging with that country to try and ascertain some of these facts that you've just outlined for us. How should the global community respond then to what Russia has said? I would have imagined any country claiming they've gotten to this stage of their vaccine would have caused a whole lot more reaction than what we're seeing to what Russia has said.
I think one has to be cautious. If you don't show your data and you don't demonstrate through the pipeline how your vaccine is working, if you don't show your animal data, you don't show your phase 1 data, and you don't show your efficacy data, it's very hard to know how effective the vaccine is. The vaccine could be as 30% effective, or it could be 80% effective. They have not said how effective their vaccine is. And so it's very important to understand it. It's also very important about how you do vaccine trials. People have to understand what they're getting enrolled in. They have to sign informed consent. You have to go through an ethics committee, and you have to make sure that you know that you're a volunteer and you can withdraw at any phase. So it's very hard to understand the interplay between ethics and the execution of this trial in this case, or these trials in Russia.
The WHO had also previously said that, there isn't any one silver bullet to be able to help us deal with the pandemic. And I wonder what this means then for the mounting anticipation for this vaccine. I mean, through your own admission, there is a global race to try find this treatment. But even if it were to arrive, is it likely to enable us to go back to the lives we used to live before this moment?
Well, we hope so. We hope by having a vaccine and other antivirals or monoclonal antibodies, we can curtail and control this epidemic. And the only way we can get back to the life that we had is to stop the transmission of coronavirus onwards. And we can do that only by using the non-pharmaceutical interventions or a vaccine. We also need more potent antivirals and monoclonal antibodies to treat it. There's no good trying to prevent it. It'll take time to roll out vaccines. We also have to make sure that there are drugs to help us treat people who have got it or who are very ill in ICU.
I imagine in many people's minds, the idea of a vaccine is going to kill the virus, and we're going to get to a pre-COVID-19 world. And by that I mean where the virus doesn't exist. But that's obviously not the situation, right? But there's also been talk about a vaccine to treat COVID-19 once you've been infected, and one to prevent infection from taking place. Which of those two are we engaging with?
Well, we're looking at the one to prevent the onward transmission. So basically, you take a vaccine, you mount an immune response, and when you're exposed to the virus, your body mounts an immune response to it. The other strategies are to use monoclonal antibodies or passive immunization, where you have an antibody that neutralizes the virus on exposure. So you have these monoclonal antibodies in your system. So when you are sick with COVID-19, it's administered, and you can prevent or mitigate the viral load and improve your outcomes. And so we must use both strategies. both active vaccination to prevent it and the use of monoclonal antibodies or other antivirals to help manage exposure and to improve the outcomes after having acquired COVID-19.
Professor Gray, whilst we have you on, I mean, we're also seeing a decline in the number of daily new infections in the country. And I wonder what you make of that, especially when it comes to whether or not we're finally in a position to start relooking some of the lockdown regulations in their current form, specifically around the contentious issues such as the banning of, the sale of alcohol and the banning of cigarette sales too.
So we have seen a slowing down of the epidemic both in Gauteng, Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. And we obviously have to watch to see how the epidemic rolls out in KwaZulu-Natal. But also the South African Medical Research Council also shows a slowing down of death rates, which means that we are into a different phase of the epidemic. Now, what could happen in this phase is that this epidemic could become what we call endemic, so that the infection rates grumble on at a low rate, but never ever go away. Or you could have a second surge if we don't make sure we keep our social distancing, we wear our masks and wash our hands. So although we can feel a lot of relief about where we are in the epidemic, we have to make sure that we don't get into a second wave like we saw in the United States or what we're seeing in Europe, and that we try and contain the transmission at a low rate in our country until we get a vaccine or some other kind of biomedical intervention. So what we have to do is continue to implement social distancing, wearing our masks and washing hands. These what we call non-pharmaceutical interventions appear to be helping the spread and the control of our epidemic in this country.
Yeah, and what does that mean for the sustained ban on alcohol and tobacco products, do you think?
Well, I think that the reason why alcohol was banned was to try and make beds available. And we know that alcohol causes trauma and accidents, and we know that they fill up emergency rooms. By banning alcohol, you created beds in the hospital sector, and you also gave the human resource, the healthcare workers, during the alcohol ban, time to either reorientate themselves to the management of COVID epidemic or to catch a breath. We're in the situation now where we have the epidemic and the medical beds under control, and hopefully that will lead to a concomitant release of the ban on alcohol. We also have to understand that alcohol is a dangerous drug in our country, and we also have to try and find ways of mitigating the terrible burden it does give us in the health sector. So I do hope that when we do open up the alcohol ban, we take steps to control the abuse of alcohol in our country.
Okay, very quickly. So you would advise the National Coronavirus Command Council to lift this ban?
Well, I would say that we need to look at, do we need the ban still? And if we don't need the ban still, is there a way to make sure that we contain the deaths and the hospital admissions from alcohol by making sure that South Africans learn to manage alcohol in a better way that prevents them from having to die or having to be involved in car accidents or having to be involved in trauma that's related to alcohol. So what we would like to see as healthcare professionals is that less burden on the healthcare sector because of alcohol abuse.
All right. Thanks very much for your time and for your insights. Certainly appreciate it. Professor Glenda Gray is President and CEO of the South African Medical Research Council, also taking part in that study led by Oxford University to try find a vaccine for COVID-19.